The Arizona Territory in the 1880s was a hard lesson in survival, written in dust and patience. The town of Red Mesa was less a town and more a stubborn suggestion, clinging to the edge of a wide, temperamental river. It was a place of high-risk business and low-grade whiskey, composed of a few saloons, one hopeful church steeple piercing the relentless blue, a cavalry fort flying colors that faded in the sun, and a ferry that seemed to argue with the water every time it crossed. The river itself was the real authority. It was the line, the boundary, the great, muddy excuse that separated the white man's grid of dusty streets from the ancient, sprawling lands of the Navajo. It was commerce, and it was division. Every evening, without fail, the setting sun would hit the high canyon walls upstream and bleed into the water, turning the current a deep, arterial red. The Navajo, watching from the mesas, called this the breath of their ancestors. The white folk in Red Mesa just called it Tuesday. Elena Harper knew that river better than she knew the Bible. She was the daughter of the man who owned Harper's Trading Post, the last building of consequence before the ferry landing. The post was neutral ground, or as neutral as ground could be in that part of the world. Elena had grown up learning the weight of flour, the value of a good blanket, and the complex languages of trade. She spoke the rapid, fluid Spanish of the vaqueros, the clipped, cautious English of the cavalrymen, and she understood the slower, more deliberate cadence of the Navajo who came to trade turquoise for coffee and sugar. She was a daughter of the West, born and raised. Her father, long a widower, had taught her to load a Winchester and ride a horse like she meant it, not just to sit side saddle. He had taught her sums and letters, and she kept the post's ledgers with a meticulous hand. But the world had a way of reminding a woman of her edges. Despite her capability, society expected her to shrink. It expected her to marry, to quiet her opinions, to trade her knowledge of the open territory for the close confines of a parlor. Inside her, a longing for the horizon, for the somewhere else she saw in the eyes of the trackers, fought a quiet war with the dutiful daughter who wanted only to see her father settled and safe. She was torn between the freedom her father had accidentally given her and the cage of expectation that everyone, including her father, now seemed eager to lock. The somewhere else had a shape. Sometimes, across the river, she saw him, a silhouette on the far ridge, as still as the rock he stood on. She only knew him by reputation. Toyasi, he who walks with storms, a Navajo warrior, or perhaps just a scout, depending on who was telling the story. He was a survivor of the great, cruel displacements that had broken his people, a man who had seen his world stolen and yet refused to disappear. He knew the white man's words, both English and Spanish, and he used them as he used his rifle sparingly, and with purpose. He guided wagon trains sometimes, but only, it was said, to protect his own people from the bandits the wagons might attract. He guided them around sacred lands, not through them. He was a guardian, not a servant. Toyasi was wary, his distrust of the white world a deep and justified scar. Yet, he engaged with it when he must. He, or his people, still traded at Harper's. There was an unspoken, unacknowledged history there. Years ago, during a winter of starvation when the agency men brought only moldy flour and broken promises, Elena's father had extended credit, trading his own dwindling stock for promises of turquoise and blankets that might never come. They had come. The Navajo remembered. And so, while Toyasi watched the fort with a cold eye, he allowed the trade with the Harper Post to continue. But the world was changing, growing smaller and harder. The change had a name, and it had arrived 3 months prior, smelling of Eastern money and iron. Silas McGraw was a railroad investor. He wore clean suits in a town built on dust, and he spoke of progress and prosperity. He wanted to push a line of steel north, straight through the heart of the high desert, straight through the lands the Navajo used for grazing, straight through their sacred places. McGraw spoke with a civilized tongue. But violence clung to him like a cheap cologne. And he had found an eager partner in the man who represented law in Red Mesa. Lieutenant James Caldwell was, to the town, a hero. He was tall in the saddle, his blue uniform always brushed, his manners impeccable. He was the protector, the man who kept the savages at bay. He was also Elena Harper's fiancé. It was a good match. Everyone said, the respectable daughter of the town's most stable merchant and the celebrated officer. Elena had believed it herself. She had mistaken his ambition for duty, his coldness for control. She did not know about the quiet agreement struck in the back room of the saloon. Silas McGraw needed the land clear of complications. Lieutenant James Caldwell needed a promotion. To get that, he needed a threat. By inflating the danger of the Navajo, by manufacturing skirmishes. He could justify a larger military presence and justify clearing the land that Silas wanted. A promotion for him, a clear path for the railroad. Elena's ritual, most afternoons, was to walk to her spot on the riverbank after her work at the post was done. It was a flat, smooth rock, warmed by the day's sun. She would sit, her skirts tucked around her, and wait for James to ride over from the fort. She sat there this evening, the air cooling, the sun beginning its fiery descent. She was looking at the water, trying to conjure the future everyone assured her she wanted. She would be Mrs. Caldwell. She would host dinners for the other officers. Her life would be stable, secure, and predictable. She tried to feel the comfort in that. But her gaze always drifted across the river, to the high mesas. She scanned the horizon for the silhouette, the shadow of Toyazi. She felt a strange pull, a disquiet. She was caught between the man in the uniform, who represented order, and the shadow on the ridge, who represented a freedom she could not even name. The sound of horses made her turn, a smile ready on her lips. But it was not just James. It was a full patrol. 6 men, their horses kicking up a cloud of alkali dust. James rode at their head, his face tight and unfamiliar. He pulled up sharply, not dismounting. "Elena, you should not be out here alone," he said. It was not a greeting. It was a reprimand. "I was waiting for you," she said, her smile faltering. "We were meant to talk about the wedding." "That'll have to wait." He gestured with his chin toward the far bank. "We are hunting cattle thieves. Navajo." Elena looked. Her eyes were sharp, trained by years of watching the river. She saw them, not on the ridge, but down by the water, in a small cove shielded by cottonwoods. But it was not a band of thieves. It was a small group, 2 women, 1 old, 1 young, tending a small fire, 3 children, 2 of them splashing at the water's edge, their laughter carrying faintly across the water. A couple of men, unarmed, packing bundles, preparing to cross. It was a family group, heading home, trying to get across the river before nightfall. "James," Elena said, standing up. "That is not warriors. That is a family. I see children." "They are where they should not be," he said, his voice flat. He turned to his sergeant. "Fire a warning shot. Disperse those vagrants." The sergeant raised his rifle. The shot cracked, echoing flatly. Across the river, the small group froze. The women grabbed the children, pulling them back from the water. They looked terrified, trapped. "James, no," Elena said, grabbing his arm. "They are just families. Let them go." He shook her off, his face dark. He was not looking at her. He was performing for his men, for the promotion he could almost taste. "They defy the Army's order to stay on their land," he snapped. "They are a threat. Fire at will." The world dissolved into smoke and noise. The volley of rifle fire was deafening. Elena screamed. Across the water, she saw the unthinkable. She saw the old woman fall. She saw one of the children, a small boy, stumble, clutch his chest, and then drop into the shallow water. It was then that the shadow detached itself from the rocks above them. He was not a shadow now. He was all solid, furious motion. Toyazi! He dropped from a ledge, landing in the middle of the terrified group, his own rifle suddenly in his hands. He was not shooting to kill. He was shooting for cover, his shots kicking up dirt in front of the soldiers' horses, making them rear. He was yelling in Navajo, not words of war, but desperate commands. Get to the horses, go! The soldiers, surprised, fired back wildly. One bullet, flying high and wide, whined past Elena's ear. It struck the cottonwood branch just above her head, sending a shower of leaves and splintered wood down on her. She froze, staring at the white, naked wood where the bark had been. She never saw him move. One second she was standing, paralyzed. The next she was hit. A solid living weight slammed into her, driving the air from her lungs. It was not a bullet. It was a man. He tackled her, driving her down, away from the tree, rolling them both into the damp, muddy bank of the river. He covered her body with his own, pressing her face into the cool earth. She could not breathe, could not think. All she knew was the crushing weight of him, the frantic hammering of his heart against her back, and the smell. He smelled of horse sweat, of clean pine, and of the sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder. The shooting sputtered, then stopped. The silence that fell was heavy and terrible. Slowly, the weight lifted. He was on his feet in one fluid motion, grabbing his rifle from the mud. And then he was gone. He vanished into the reeds and was across the river before James's men had even lowered their smoking rifles. Elena lay gasping in the mud, her hands shaking so badly she could not push herself up. The world had turned upside down in 30 seconds. The man society called a savage had just saved her life. The man she had promised to marry, her hero in his clean blue uniform, was a murderer of children. James finally dismounted and stalked over to her, his face a mask of fury. "Elena, are you hurt?" he demanded. He did not sound concerned. He sounded annoyed. He reached down and pulled her roughly to her feet. You, she could not form the words. "They ambushed us," James said, already crafting the lie. His eyes were cold, daring her to contradict him. "A vicious, unprovoked attack. That brave man saved you, it seems, but the rest were hostile. I will have to report this to the colonel. A full-scale threat." He turned and barked orders to his men, ignoring her completely. Elena stood alone on the bank, shaking, covered in mud. Her hands still smelled of the river and the faint, smoky scent of the man who had covered her. She looked at the water. The sun was almost gone, and the river was running a deep, dark red. It had always been the breath of the ancestors. But as she watched a dark stain spread from the small body on the far bank, she knew, for the first time, she was looking at blood. The lie, born in the smoke of rifles, found fertile ground. By the next morning, Red Mesa was a town under siege, not from the Navajo, but from its own fear. The word ambush was spoken as fact. The attack was analyzed in the saloon, lamented in the general store, and prayed over in the church. Lieutenant James Caldwell's report to the colonel at Fort Lowell was a tidy piece of fiction, painting a picture of a brave patrol outnumbered and beset by hostile forces. He was, by noon, a hero again. Silas McGraw, ever the opportunist, fanned the flames. He bought whiskey for the men who gathered at the saloon, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the dusty den. He did not raise his voice. He spoke calmly, reasonably, of the future. He spoke of progress. Yes, but more. He spoke of safety. He painted the railroad as a line of defense, an iron artery that would bring soldiers, supplies, and civilization. It would be, he implied, a bulwark against the savagery that nipped at their very heels. The town, for the most part, wanted to believe him. They needed to believe in the blue uniforms at the fort. It was a simpler world if you knew, with certainty, who the good men were. A line was drawn by the river, and all virtue was on this side. But there were doubts, quiet as a snake in the dust. Men like Elena's father, Samuel, who had run the trading post for nearly 20 years, knew the truth of the Navajo. He knew they did not bring children and old women to a firefight. He knew the difference between a war party and a family trying to go home. These men, the ones who traded in blankets and coffee rather than bullets, kept their mouths shut. They had to live here, and while they might not fear the Navajo, they were beginning to fear their neighbors. Elena felt the chill of that new fear all day. She was an outcast in her own life. On Sunday, she walked into the church, her Bible in her hand, hoping for the comfort of ritual. The building was full, but the space around her was cold. She heard the whispers from the pew behind her, a dry hiss of judgment. "Too soft, that one." A woman muttered, "She is not cut out to be an officer's wife, cannot handle the realities of the frontier." It was Mrs. Davies, the mother of a young private who had been on the patrol, who was the cruelest. She cornered Elena by the door as the congregation filed out into the blinding sun. Her fingers dug into Elena's arm like claws. "You almost got my boy killed," the woman hissed, her face pale and pinched with fury. "Filling the lieutenant's head, making him worry about you when he should have been watching for danger. You distracted him. Shame on you." Elena pulled her arm free, her stomach churning. The guilt they tried to heap on her was not the guilt she felt. Her crime, she knew, was not being at the river. Her crime was her own stunning blindness. For a year, she had looked at James Caldwell and seen a protector. She had seen strength and duty. She had been wrong. All that was there was a cold, polished ambition, a hunger that would feed on anything to get what it wanted. She felt a sickening wave of responsibility. She had asked to meet him there. She had trusted him. She had set the stage for a massacre. He came to the post later that afternoon. He did not come to the house or meet her in private. He walked straight into the trading post, in front of her father and two prospectors, his uniform immaculate, his boots polished. He was there to restore the image, to claim his property. "Elena," he said, his voice full of a false, public warmth. "We should speak." She nodded, her face pale. She untied her apron and followed him outside, into the narrow alley between the post and the assay office. The air smelled of wood smoke and lye soap. "I am glad to see you are recovered," he began, attempting a gentle tone. "Yesterday was a shock, but you are safe. That is all that matters." She looked at him. She saw the handsome lines of his face, the clear blue of his eyes, and for the first time she saw the complete and terrifying emptiness behind them. He was a beautiful, hollow thing. "Why did you shoot them?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, not accusing, but searching. It was a plea for an answer that was not a lie. They were not warriors. James, there were women. There was a little boy. I saw him fall into the water. His face, which had been arranged in lines of concern, hardened. The mask slipped. "That," he said, his voice clipping the words, "is war. Elena, it is something you do not and cannot understand." "That was not war," she said, and her own voice surprised her. It was sharp and strong. "That was murder." "It was a necessary action," he snapped, dropping all pretense. "An action to secure this territory. And it is not your place to question it. You should never have been there. Your presence endangered my patrol. You distracted me." There it was. He was not sorry. He was angry that she had seen. He blamed her, not for the shooting, but for being a witness. "I distracted you," she repeated. The words tasted like bile. "Yes, you are a civilian, a woman. Your place is in the town. Elena, not at the river, and certainly not questioning military orders." She stared at him, and in that hot, dusty alley, the man she had promised to marry ceased to exist. He was a stranger, and a dangerous one. "I see," she said, and the truth of it chilled her. She turned, without another word, and walked back into the trading post, leaving him standing alone by the rain barrel. The engagement was over. She knew it, even if he did not. By the next day, the lie had become law. Silas McGraw, flanked by James and the territorial marshal, called an emergency meeting of the town council. It was held in the saloon. Silas, with his smooth voice, spoke of federal backing and the promise of prosperity. James, with his hard voice, spoke of security and the escalating threat. Before sundown, the Red Mesa security order was nailed to the door of the saloon and, insultingly, to the front door of Harper's trading post. The rules were simple and brutal. No Navajo was to be permitted within the town limits after sunset. All trade in firearms, ammunition, and whiskey to any native was immediately forbidden. All other trade, even in flour or blankets, was to be restricted, logged, and monitored by a cavalry patrol. Samuel Harper read the proclamation, his face turning a dull, angry red. "This is madness," he said, loud enough for the men in the store to hear. "This cuts off half my trade. This punishes the people who have done nothing but trade peacefully for 20 years. For a lie." "Papa, be careful," Elena whispered, placing a hand on his arm. "Careful," he barked, pulling his arm away. "I have been careful. Elena, I have been fair. That is more than I can say for some. The Navajo. They remember fairness, and they will remember this." He slapped the paper with the back of his hand. He was furious, but beneath the fury, Elena saw the deep, cold glint of fear. He was afraid of losing his license. He was afraid of losing the post he had spent his life building. Elena could not stay inside. She felt suffocated by the whispers in the town, by her father's fear, by the ghost of the man she had almost married. 2 nights after the shooting, she slipped out of the house. She told her father she needed air. She needed to see the river. She walked to her spot, the flat rock. The moon was a high, thin crescent, providing little light. But she knew the path by heart. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. The far bank was invisible, a wall of darkness. The river itself was just a faint, silvery sound. She knelt, touching the mud, the spot where he had landed on her, where his body had pressed her into the bank. It was real. "You should not be here." The voice came from the darkness of the cottonwoods, not 10 feet away. She gasped, scrambling backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Toyazi stepped into the faint moonlight. He was not a shadow this time. He was solid, and he was dangerously real. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a dark shirt, blending with the night. His rifle was in his hand, held loosely, but she had no doubt he could use it in a second. His eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on her. "They are hunting you," she whispered, her heart hammering. "They are always hunting," he said. His English was clear, precise, the cadence different from the townspeople. "You came back. Why?" "I had to see," she said, her voice shaking. "See what?" he asked, his voice harsh. "The place where your people murder children." The words stung, as they were meant to. "He is not my people," she said, surprised by the force in her own voice. "Not anymore." He moved a step closer, and she could see his face more clearly now. It was a strong, hard face, marked by a life she could not imagine. He studied her, searching for the lie. "He is the man you will marry." "He is a man I do not know," she said. She looked away, toward the dark water. "Your people, the boy, the old woman." "The boy was my cousin's son," he said. His voice was flat, empty of all emotion. "The old woman was my mother's sister. They are buried, in the way of our people." "I am sorry," she whispered. The words were pathetic. They were dust. "Sorry," he repeated, and the word was a snarl. "Your people are always sorry. After the promises are broken, after the bullets fly, after the land is gone. Not all of us," she said, meeting his gaze. My father. He has always been an honest man. Your father is one man, Toyazi said. He trades for blankets. Your soldiers trade for lives. There is no balance. They stood in the heavy silence. Two worlds balanced on a knife's edge. He was everything she had been taught to fear, and she was everything he had been taught to hate. Then his expression shifted. A flicker of curiosity, of calculation, entered his eyes. The soldiers, they did not follow us. After the shooting, why? Elena thought back, trying to push past the horror. I do not know. James Lieutenant Caldwell took me back to the post. He had to report to his colonel. He said you ambushed them. Toyazi's eyes narrowed. He lies. But if he lies, he would want us dead, to prove his lie. Yet no patrol followed. He had to control me, she said, the realization dawning on her. He had to make sure I did not contradict him. I was the other witness. The warrior stared at her. You did not confirm his story. It was not a question. Your silence. It bought us time to move our families. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He thinks you are his weakness, his tool. And you, she said, her voice trembling. You saved me. You pushed me down. Why you were saving your people. Why me? I do not make war on women, he said simply. And I owe your father. For the winter of the deep snow. My family ate because his ledger was open. He turned his gaze north, upriver, toward the high mesas. He will not stop, Caldwell, the man in the clean suit. Silas McGraw, she said. The railroad. Toyazi nodded, his face grim in the moonlight. The Iron Snake, we have heard the stories. It will cut our grazing lands in half. It will foul the water. It is a new kind of war, a war of fences and iron. He spoke with such intelligence, such cold clarity. This was not the savage of James's reports. This was a man fighting for his home, for the very survival of his people. A strange, quiet respect settled in her chest. He was the only person who had spoken the truth to her in days. You must go, she said, a sudden urgency in her voice. It is not safe for you here. They will be patrolling the river. This is my land, he said, not with anger, but with a deep, weary certainty. It is never safe, but it is mine. He looked at her, his eyes holding hers. Do not come back to the river. Daughter of Harper, it is not a place for you now. He stepped backward, melting into the shadows of the cottonwoods. He did not make a sound. He was simply there, and then he was gone. She was not, however, unseen. A man lay on his belly on the ferry landing, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. He was one of Silas McGraw's men, paid to watch the river, to watch the fort, to watch everyone. He had seen the small, buckskin-clad figure meet the warrior. He had seen them talk. He scrambled to his feet and hurried toward the lights of the saloon. He found Silas McGraw in a backroom card game with Lieutenant Caldwell. The hired man leaned in and whispered, The Harper girl, boss. She was out at the riverbank, just now, in the dark. Silas did not look up from his cards. Alone. Not exactly, boss. She was talking to a Navajo. A tall one. Looked like that warrior they all talk about. The one they call Stormwalker. Silas McGraw laid his cards down, face up. He smiled slowly. Well, is that not just fascinating? James Caldwell's head snapped up. A dark, ugly flush crept up his neck. It was not the jealousy of a spurned lover. It was the cold fury of a man who demands control. She was his property, his fiancée, and she was consorting with the very enemy he had fabricated. She was undermining him. She was making a fool of him. Worse, she was talking to him. Toyazi, the other witness, the only other person who knew exactly what had happened on that riverbank. His ambition and his pride knotted into a cold, hard fear. She knew too much, and she was speaking to the one man who could destroy him. Later that night, when the saloon was quiet, Silas and James sat alone in McGraw's hotel room. "You have a problem, Lieutenant," Silas said, pouring 2 glasses of expensive brandy. "I have a situation," James corrected, his voice stiff. "You have a fiancé who is holding secret meetings with a hostile savage in the middle of the night," Silas said, his voice smooth as the liquor. "That sounds like a problem to me. It sounds like a security risk. What if she is feeding him information? What if she tells him about our plans for the Northern Survey?" "She knows nothing of our plans," James snapped. "She knows you shot a child," Silas said, his voice dangerously soft. "That is more than enough to make a good woman do irrational things. She has compromised you, Lieutenant. Her word against yours creates doubt, and I do not pay for doubt." James stared into his glass, his knuckles white. "You need to control her," Silas advised, swirling his brandy. "Marry her, quickly. Put a baby in her and move her into the fort, where she belongs. Get her away from that trading post, or if she will not be controlled." He left the threat hanging in the smoky air. "She will be controlled," James said, his voice a low growl. "See that she is, because if you lose your reputation, you are of no use to me. And this entire venture, this railroad, rests on your reputation as a hero." James stood, the brandy untouched. His ambition trapped him by his own lie, and by the woman he had so badly underestimated. He had to get her back. He had to silence her. And he had to eliminate the other witness. He walked out of the hotel with a new, chilling resolve. He would reclaim Elena, securing his dominance and his reputation, and he would hunt down Toyazi and kill him. He would prove to Red Mesa that he was the hero they needed, even if he had to start a war to do it. The tension in Red Mesa was a dry, choking thing, like the dust that never settled. James Caldwell did not approach Elena again. He had tried to reclaim her with authority and failed. Now, he would try to isolate her. He began his work in the shadows, speaking to the men at the fort, his words finding their way to their wives, and from there, into the bloodstream of the town. He did not call Elena a liar. He was too smart for that. He painted her as a victim. He spoke of his poor, misguided fiancée, her nerves shattered by the terrible ordeal at the river. He suggested, with a heavy sigh, that she was not herself, that she was perhaps enchanted by the very savage who had, in a confusing twist, saved her. He used the town's deepest, darkest fear, the fear of their women being stolen, not just in body, but in mind, by the wildness of the land. The whispers that had started in the church now followed Elena down the street. Women pulled their children closer when she passed. They saw her as tainted, bewitched, a potential traitor to her own kind. The Reverend, a man whose God feared progress less than he feared the natives, paid a solemn visit to Samuel Harper. He spoke of a daughter's duty, of community stability, and of the danger of a wayward spirit. Elena's father, caught between his daughter's strange, new resolve and the town's mounting suspicion, was a man in a vice. The trade at the post had fallen by more than half. The new security orders meant that few Navajo came to trade, and now his white customers were also staying away, as if her father, too, were somehow contaminated by her strange behavior. The pressure was building, but it was a visit from Silas McGraw that finally brought the threat into sharp, terrifying focus. He did not come to buy whiskey. He came to buy land. He arrived at the post one morning, not long after it opened, and asked to speak to Samuel Harper in his office. Elena, working the ledgers, watched him go. McGraw left his fine leather satchel on the counter. It was an accident, or perhaps a design, as he was speaking to her father in the back room, his voice a low, persuasive rumble. The satchel tipped over. It was not locked. A sheaf of papers and a small, leather-bound notebook spilled onto the floor. Elena knelt to retrieve them, her hands moving quickly, professionally, and then she saw it. It was a map, hand-drawn in precise ink, tucked into the notebook. It was not a map of the territory she knew. It was a map of the future, a thick black line labeled Proposed NDAR. Route. Northern Arizona Rail slashed across the paper. It did not follow the river, as most trails did. It cut straight through the high country. It cut straight through a place she recognized from Yazi's words, the high-watered valley where the Navajo grazed their horses. And then, as it neared Red Mesa, it made a sharp turn, crossing the river and running directly through the parcel of land where Harper's trading post stood. Her blood ran cold. When Silas and her father emerged, McGraw was smiling. Her father was not. "Mr. McGraw has made a generous offer for our land." "Elena," her father said, his voice strained. "Indeed, Mr. Harper," Silas said, his eyes finding Elena's. They were cold and bright as a new dollar. "The government, you see, is very keen on this expansion. When they designate a route, land is often requisitioned. For the public good, they set the price, and it is rarely generous. My offer, on the other hand, is private, 25% above what you would likely get from a federal assessor. A simple, clean transaction. Think about it." He gathered his satchel, his gaze lingering on her, and left. "He wants to tear it down," Elena said, her voice flat. "He wants to tear down our home." "He wants to pay us for it," her father said, rubbing his face. "Maybe it is time. Elena, this town is turning sour." She looked at him, at the fear in his eyes, and she knew he was close to breaking. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a piece of parchment and a charcoal pencil, with the map burned into her memory. She copied it, every line, every notation. The Northern Arizona Rail, the mark for the grazing valley, the black line that destroyed her home. 2 nights later, she was at the river. She had not known if he would come. She had only waited. A small, dark shape on the familiar rock. The map tucked into her dress. The air was heavy, the moon obscured by a dark, greasy-looking bank of clouds moving in from the north. A strange, metallic smell was in the air. He did not come from the shadows. He came from the water. He was suddenly just there, his horse dripping, its breath a white plume in the cooling air. He dismounted and approached, his rifle in his hand. "I told you not to come back here," he said, his voice low and harsh. "I had to," she said, her voice trembling, but not from fear, from urgency. She held out the parchment. "He is going to destroy your home, and mine." He did not take it. He stared at her. His eyes narrowed in the gloom. "What is this?" "A map. From Silas McGraw's book. I copied it." She unfolded it, her fingers clumsy. "He is building a railroad. Look," she pointed. "Here is the river. Here is Red Mesa. This line goes straight through the valley, the one you spoke of, where your horses graze." He finally took the map, holding it close, his head bent. He might not read all the white man's words, but he knew the language of the land. He knew what a line meant. "The iron snake," he said, and his voice was flat with a terrible understanding. "It will take our water. It will kill the grass. They will push us out, again, into the dry lands." "He offered to buy my father's land," she whispered. "He wants to run the line right through our trading post. He wants to wipe it all away, all of it." He looked up from the map, his gaze piercing. "Why do you show me this? This is your people's war, not mine." "It is his war," she corrected, jabbing a finger at the map. "Silas McGraw and James Caldwell. They are in it together, and they are crushing everyone who is in their path. You, me, my father, anyone. Does that not make it our war, too?" He was silent for a long, heavy moment. He refolded the map and handed it back to her. "This paper," he said, tapping it. "It means nothing. My uncle and the elders do not read maps. They see only the land." "Then show them the land," she said. a desperate plan forming. Let me come with you. Let me show them. I can explain what this means. What McGraw is doing? He stared at her as if she were mad. You come to our camp, the daughter of the white trader, the woman who was to marry the soldier. That woman is gone, Elena said, and she knew it was true. There is only me, and I am trying to save my home. The only way I can see how is to help you save yours. He weighed her, his eyes moving over her face, searching. You would be in great danger, he said. I am in danger now, she said. We all are. He made his decision. He nodded. Once. Come, but be silent, and do as I say. He pulled her up onto his horse behind him. The animal was strong, and she clung to Toe's waist, her face pressed against the rough cotton of his shirt. He smelled of smoke and the metallic tang of the coming storm. They did not cross the river. They rode up the bank, into the high, broken country, following a trail she had never known existed. They arrived at the camp an hour before dawn. It was not a camp. Not really. It was a collection of hidden hogans, built into the side of a box canyon, invisible from any distance. A dog barked, and a man with a rifle appeared from the rocks. He spoke to Toe in the low, guttural clicks of the Navajo language. His eyes on Elena were not friendly. Toe led her to the largest hogan. Inside, an old man sat by a low fire, his face a web of deep lines, his eyes bright and intelligent. This was Toe's uncle, his mother's brother, an elder named Hastin. Toe spoke for a long time. Elena stood by the door, feeling small and terribly white. Hastin listened, his gaze never leaving her. When Toe was finished, the old man spoke. His voice was like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. Toe translated. He asks why a white woman cares if the Navajo starve. Elena stepped forward, her hands clasped to stop them from shaking. I do not know your word for it, she said, her voice clear. But in my language, we call it home. The man building the railroad is taking my home, just as he is taking yours. He lied to my town. He made my fiancé. He made him murder your people to get that land. I am here because I believe that is wrong, and I am here because I cannot fight him alone. The old man watched her. He spoke again, just a few words. He says, Toe translated, his voice neutral, that words are wind. He asks what you offer. The truth, Elena said. And this, she held out the map again. This is his plan. This is his weapon. You fight with guns and arrows. He fights with paper and lies. I am offering you his weapon. She stayed. It was a test. The women in the camp brought her food, cornbread and roasted meat, and watched her with open, unnerving curiosity. She was not a prisoner, but she was not a guest. She was a thing to be observed. She sat by the fire, mending her own skirt which had torn on the ride, her small sewing kit from her pocket a strange reminder of her old life. She proved she was not useless. She proved she was not afraid. As the day wore on, Toe sat on a ridge above the camp, looking down, not at the hogans, but east, toward Red Mesa. His mind was at war. He had brought her here, this white woman. He had brought her past the centuries, into a place of his people. He had broken a dozen laws of his own heart. His entire life had been defined by the white man's cruelty. The stories of the long walk, the great march of exile, were his lullabies. He had been taught that their words were poison, their treaties were traps, and their friendship was the cruelest lie of all. And yet, this woman, she had not lied. She had come to him with a truth that could destroy her. She had renounced the soldier. She had offered his own weapon, the paper map, back to him. He was a warrior. He knew how to fight with a rifle, a knife, and a horse. But that was a young man's fight, a fight of rage. It was a fight his people had been losing for 50 years. He looked at the map, which he now held in his own hand. He looked at the lines, the strange words. This, he realized, was a different battlefield. Maybe the only way to save the land was not to bleed on it, but to use the white man's own magic against him. Their laws, their paper. He hated it. He hated the world it came from. But if trusting her, if using this, was the way to protect the children and the elders, then perhaps it was a new kind of war he must learn to fight. He was no longer just a warrior. He was becoming a protector. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sky tore open. It was not a gentle rain. The clouds that had been gathering all day unloaded their burden in a single, violent act. The wind howled, and the rain came down not in drops, but in solid, gray sheets. The dry creek bed below the camp began to hiss, then roar. Toe scrambled down the rocks. "We must go," he yelled to Elena, pulling her from the hogun. "Now, back to the town. If we do not, you will be trapped here for a week, or you will be found." The ride back was a nightmare. The world had vanished, dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos. The trail was gone, and the water was rising. They were halfway to the river when they heard it, a sound deeper than thunder. A sound like the mountain itself was tearing in half. A flash flood. A wall of brown, churning water, thick with mud and ripped-up trees, was coming down the canyon they had to cross. "Hold on!" Toe yelled, kicking the horse, trying to race the water to the other side. They were too late. The water hit them like a fist, not from the front, but from the side. The horse screamed as its legs were cut out from under it. Elena was torn from Toe's back, a piece of driftwood in a monstrous current. She was drowning. The water was thick, like being buried in cold mud. It was in her mouth, her nose. She fought, but there was nothing to fight. Then, a hand. It grabbed her hair, hard. It was not a gentle rescue. It was a desperate, brutal act of possession. Toe hauled her head above the churning surface. He was holding onto the roots of a half-drowned tree. His other arm locked around her. "The ledge!" he roared, pointing. A small rock ledge, barely a foothold, was 10 feet away. It was an impossible distance. "I cannot," she choked. "You will!" he yelled. As he tried to move, the bank he was on began to collapse. A large rock, part of the cliff face, shifted. "The rock!" she screamed. Seeing it before he did, it was poised to fall. Not on them, but on the mass of roots and debris that was holding back the main force of the current. If it fell, the logjam would break, and a new, more violent wave would be released. "I see it," he said, but he was wrong. He was looking at the wrong rock. The one she saw was smaller, but key. She did something she could not explain. She pulled her arm from his grip. In her dress, wet and heavy, she kept a small pistol. Her father had made her carry it. She pulled it free. "Elena, no!" he yelled, thinking she was giving up. She raised the pistol, bracing her arm, and fired. The shot was a pop in the roar of the water. She missed. She fired again. The bullet struck the small keystone. It shattered. The logjam did not break. It shifted. The water, diverted, carved a new, easier path away from them, lessening the pressure. Toe used the moment. He lunged, grabbing her, and threw them both toward the ledge. They hit the rock hard, scraping flesh, but they were out of the main current. They clawed their way up, into a shallow cave just above the floodline. They collapsed, gasping, on the cold, wet stone. They were alive. They were soaked, freezing, and alive. The storm raged outside. A gray curtain. The cave was small, barely a hollow in the rock, but it was dry. They were both shaking violently, their teeth chattering. "The fire?" Elena stammered. Flint and steel were in a waterproof pouch. He got a tiny, sputtering flame going from a nest of dry tinder he found in the back of the cave, feeding it with a few dry branches. It was a small, smoky fire, but it was life. They huddled by it. It was not enough. "You will freeze," Toe said, his voice rough. He was looking at her, not as a woman, not as a white person, but as a living creature on the edge of death. He had one dry blanket in his pack. He wrapped it around her shoulders. She was still shaking. "This is foolish," he said, more to himself than to her. He sat down behind her, pulling her back against his chest. He was solid, strong, and surprisingly warm. He wrapped the blanket around both of them, cocooning them in a small, shared space of wool and body heat. She was pressed against him, her back to his chest, his arms loosely around her. It was an intimacy so profound, so far beyond the polite courtships of her world, that she felt her breath catch. He smelled of rain and smoke. They sat in silence for a long time, the roar of the flood and the hiss of the fire, the only sounds. "You were fast," he said, his breath warm by her ear. "The gun. You saw the rock. I did not." "My father taught me to shoot," she whispered. "He wanted me to marry, to be safe, but he taught me to shoot first." She laughed, a small, broken sound. "I am so tired. I am tired of being what they want, the daughter, the fiancée, the good woman of the town." She leaned her head back against his shoulder. "I think I have been waiting my whole life to be in a place I was not supposed to be." He was quiet. Then he spoke. His voice was different, deeper. "The old ones," he said. "They tell us of the long walk. When the soldiers came, they burned our fields. They cut down our peach trees. They marched us 300 miles to a place of sickness, Bosque Redondo." He had never told this to a white person. He had never spoken these words in English. "Many did not come back. My grandmother, my father's first son. We are a people who remember how to be hunted. We look at your world, and we see the man with the gun, the man with the paper, the man with the iron. You come, and you take, and you never stop." "I am not talking," she whispered, her eyes closed. "I am here." "Yes," he said. He looked down at the top of her damp head, a strange, fierce protectiveness rising in him. "You are here." They made a promise, though it was not spoken. It was sealed in the shared warmth, in the roar of the flood that had tried to kill them, in the stories of their two broken worlds. They would fight, not for themselves, not for pride. "We must," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. "We must fight for the ones who cannot, the children, the elders, the ones who are just trying to get home." He pulled the blanket tighter around them. "We will." The rumors had a full day to fester before Elena returned. When she finally walked back into Red Mesa, mud-caked, hair wild, her dress torn, and alone, the town had already convicted her. She had not just been enchanted. She had run off. She had spent 2 nights in the wilderness with a Navajo warrior. She was, in their eyes, a ruined woman. She walked into the trading post. The bell above the door chimed. Her father was standing behind the counter, his face ashen. He looked 10 years older. "Where have you been?" His voice was a dead, hollow sound. "I was trapped," she said. "The flash flood, in the canyon." "With him?" She nodded. "Yes, he survived." Her father looked at the floor. He could not meet her eyes. "The Reverend was here," he said. "James Lieutenant Caldwell was here. He is willing to forgive you. Elena, he is willing to forget this madness. He says you are not well." "He is willing to forgive me," she repeated, the word a bitter joke. "You must go to him," her father pleaded, his voice cracking. "You must tell him you are sorry, that you were confused. We will lose everything. Elena, they will take the post. We will have nothing." Elena looked at her father. She saw the man who had taught her to shoot, to ride, to be strong, and she saw him now, broken by fear, by shame, by the world he had tried to navigate with simple, honest rules. She walked over to him and put her muddy hands on his. "No, Papa," she said, her voice gentle, but with a core of iron he had never heard. "We will not apologize. We will not be afraid. They are the liars. They are the murderers. Elena, he whispered, do not do this. I have to, she said. She looked past him, through the window, toward the river she could not see. I will not trade my father's store, or my good name, or even my life for a lie. She turned and walked out of the store, past the staring eyes of the few customers, and into her room. She had made her choice. She was no longer a daughter waiting. She was no longer a fiancée. She did not know what she was, but she knew, for the first time in her life, who she was, and she was ready to fight. Elena's refusal was not a private act. It was a declaration of war, and James Caldwell had heard it. Her return, muddy and defiant, had shattered his plan to forgive and reabsorb her. She was not a victim. She was a rebel, and she was, he now knew, actively consorting with the enemy. The news that she had been in the Navajo camp, brought to him by a nervous scout, solidified his resolve. But Silas McGraw, a man who saw profit in all things, saw in Elena's rebellion something more than just a personal affront. She is not just with him, Silas explained to James in the back room of the hotel, a cloud of expensive cigar smoke between them. I have had my men watching. She is talking to the other landowners, Old Man Peterson, who owns the springs, the McCafferty brothers, who run cattle up north, the ones who have refused to sell. James's face was a thundercloud. She is organizing them. She is, Silas agreed, tapping the ash from his cigar. She is giving them a spine. She is turning your confused woman narrative into a righteous leader one. And that, Lieutenant, is bad for business. Worse, she is uniting them with the Navajo. If the ranchers and the natives ever realize they have a common enemy, well, he let the thought hang. So we act, James said, his voice a low growl. We act, Silas affirmed. But not in a disorganized fashion. We need to do this cleanly. He leaned forward, his eyes bright. You need a villain, Lieutenant, a real one. Not just some vague hostile force. You need a name. Toyazi, James spat. Precisely. The warrior who ambushed your patrol. The savage who abducted your fiancée. Silas smiled. And now the murderer of a soldier. We have not had any soldier killed, James said, confused. Not yet, Silas said. But one of your men, Private Harris, has a weakness for my whiskey. And for my cards. He owes me, let us just say he owes me a significant sum. He will be found. Tomorrow morning. In a dry wash 2 miles from here. An arrow in his back. A Navajo arrow. James stared at him. The cold, calculated evil of the plan was breathtaking. Then, Silas continued, you will have your mandate. You will have the full backing of the fort, the town, and the territory to hunt down this murderer. You will launch a full security operation up in that canyon. You will catch him. You will deal with him. And at the same time, your men will pay a visit to the ranches along the river. Remind them of the dangers of living so far from protection. Frighten the cattle. Burn a haystack. Make them feel the threat. Make them want to sell. We clean out the canyon, and we clear the deeds. All in one stroke. The plan worked. As Silas's plans always did, Private Harris was found. The town was gripped by a new wave of hysteria. This was not a skirmish. This was murder. Elena, hearing the news, felt ill. She knew, with absolute certainty, that Toyazi had not done it. It was a lie, crafted from a dead man's body. James was given a full platoon, which he reluctantly supplemented with a dozen civilian volunteers. Hard, silent men who took their pay from Silas McGraw. They rode out of town with grim, righteous faces, heading for the high country. The news reached the Navajo camp, not as a rumor, but as a hard fact, carried by a boy who had been watching the fort. He had seen the body brought in. He had heard the talk. He had slipped away, running miles to bring the warning. Toyazi knew exactly what it meant. He was being framed, and they were coming. He had to move the elders and the children, Not to a safer camp, but to a hidden place. A series of caves known only to his people. A place they could pass through, not stay. He was leading them, a column of 20 people, only 5 of whom were warriors, through the narrow, twisting canyon that offered the fastest route. When he saw the glint, it was a mistake a soldier would make. A man had shifted on the ridge above, and the sun had caught the brass button on his uniform. Toe raised his hand, hissing a command in Navajo. The column froze. He had walked them into a trap. The first shot came from the man with the button. It was high, a signal, and then the ridges on both sides of the canyon erupted. "Go!" he roared, shoving the old man, hasten, toward the mules. "To the narrow path, run!" It was a slaughter. James was not trying to arrest anyone. He was trying to exterminate them. The rattle of cavalry carbines was punctuated by the heavier, booming reports of the buffalo rifles wielded by Silas's men. Horses screamed. Men yelled. The Red Canyon walls echoed with death. Back in Red Mesa, the same boy who had warned the camp had come for Elena. He had found her at the back of the post, stacking wood. He was out of breath, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with terror. "Soldiers!" he panted, in the broken mix of English and Spanish they used for trade. "Many soldiers. They hunt Toe in the Painted Canyon. Now, they shoot." Elena's blood turned to ice. She did not think. She did not pause. She ran inside. Her father was at the front counter, his head in his hands. "Elena, no," he began, seeing the look on her face. "I have to," she said. She ran to the back room and grabbed her father's rifle, the heavy Winchester he kept cleaned and oiled. She strapped on his ammunition belt, stuffing her pockets with extra cartridges. "You will be killed," he shouted, grabbing her arm as she ran for the door. "He is not your concern. This is not your fight." "He is," she said, pulling free, her voice shaking with a fury he had never seen. "And it is." She was on her horse, the fastest mare in their stable. In less than a minute, she flew out of the town, a lone, desperate figure, leaving her father's shouts to be swallowed by the dust. She was no longer a spectator. She was no longer a victim. She was, finally, a participant. She rode with a reckless speed, her only guide the rising plumes of smoke and the distant, sickening pop-pop-pop of rifle fire. The scene she arrived on was chaotic. She reined in her horse at the canyon's mouth, high on a ridge, looking down. Below, Toe and his 4 warriors had formed a living shield. They were using the terrain, firing and falling back, drawing the soldiers' attention, giving the women and children precious seconds to scramble toward a narrow split in the rock wall, a secret path. Toe was magnificent. He moved like a dancer, firing, ducking, reloading, never staying in one place, his voice calm as he called out commands. He was the center of the storm. And then she saw James. He was not with his men down in the canyon. He was on a ledge opposite her, slightly higher. He was prone, his body still. He was not firing into the fray. He had taken his time, found the perfect spot, and he was taking careful aim. He was waiting. His target was singular. His rifle was pointed directly at Toe Yazi's back. Toe, busy covering the retreat of the last child, was exposed. He rose from behind a rock to fire, and James's body tensed. He was beginning to squeeze the trigger. Elena did not think. She did not aim. She reacted. She ripped her father's rifle from her saddle, levered a round, and fired. The shot was long, too long for a pistol, but not for the Winchester. She was not aiming for James. She was aiming for his gun, his arm, anything. The heavy slug struck the rock just in front of his rifle, sending a spray of stone chips into his face. But it was the impact, the sheer force, that did the work. It struck the wooden stock of his rifle, shattering it and tearing it from his grasp. He screamed, clutching his hand not from a bullet, but from a dozen sharp, wooden splinters. He rolled back, his face a mask of astonished pain. His head snapped up, and he saw her, Across the canyon, his ex-fiancée sitting on her horse, rifle in hand. The shock of it, the raw, personal humiliation of it, was deeper than any bullet. She had not just defied him. She had not just left him. She had taken up arms against him. She had chosen them. Down below, the sound of her shot, echoing from a new direction, had given Toe the second he needed. He looked up, saw James scrambling, and then, across the canyon, he saw Elena. Her face was white, her hair wild, the rifle still hot in her hands. He had no time for wonder. He gave a sharp whistle. His men, their purpose served, vanished into the secret path. Toe was the last, giving her one long, unreadable look before he, too, was gone. The ambush was a failure. The main targets had escaped. James, his hand bleeding, his pride in shreds, and his authority shattered in front of his men, was forced to call a retreat. He rode back to town in a silent, black rage. Silas McGraw was not silent. When he heard the news, his fury was cold and precise. "She did what?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She fired on us," James spat, his hand wrapped in a bloody bandage. "She helped him escape." "Then she has made her choice," Silas said, "and she will live with the consequences, or perhaps she will not." He looked at James, his eyes flat. "Your emotional attachment is clearly over. Good. Now we can proceed without sentiment." That night, Red Mesa learned what true power looked like. It started just after midnight, a flicker of orange in the window of the saloon. A man yelled, then another. The bell in the church steeple began to clang, a frantic, desperate sound. Fire. But it was not the town. It was the Harper trading post. And it was not the post itself, not the house where Elena and her father slept. It was the warehouse, the large wooden building that held all their stock, all their flour, their blankets, their ammunition, their whiskey, their future, everything. By the time the townspeople, moving with a strange, deliberate slowness, had formed a bucket brigade, it was too late. The warehouse was a roaring inferno, lighting the night sky, raining sparks down on the river. The heat was so intense it buckled the walls of the post itself. Elena and her father stood in the street, in their nightclothes, and watched their life burn. Her father was a statue, his face illuminated by the flames, blank with shock, when the roof finally collapsed, sending a volcano of fire and embers into the sky. A sound broke from him. It was not a word. It was a howl, a sound of absolute, bottomless despair. He turned to Elena, his face twisted, tears cutting clean paths through the soot that already covered his face. "You!" he screamed, and he grabbed her, his fingers biting into her arms. "You did this with your pride, with your savages. He warned me, Silas McGraw. He warned me. He said to get control of you. He said you were trouble." He shook her, his grief making him strong. "You brought this down on us. You ruined us. Why for what? For a murderer, for him." Elena stood limp in his grasp, the heat of the fire on her face, the ice of her father's words in her heart. She was surrounded by enemies, and the man who should have been her last ally was now, in his pain, the cruelest of all. She looked at the fire, at the faces of the townsfolk, who watched with a mixture of pity and a cold, "I told you so," righteousness. She looked at her father's broken face, and the grief, the fear, it all burned away, leaving behind something hard and clear and unbreakable. He was wrong. Her father was wrong. It was not her fault. She had not started this. She had only refused to be a victim of it. Whether she had stayed silent, married James, and been a good wife or not, this day would have come. Silas McGraw's greed was a fire, and it would have burned them anyway, just perhaps a little more slowly. It would have taken their land, their post, their dignity, one piece at a time. All she had done was refuse to be kindling. "No, Papa," she said, her voice quiet, but it cut through his rage. She pulled his hands from her arms. "I did not do this. He did. Silas McGraw. He did this because you would not sell. He did this because I would not be silent. This is not justice. Papa, this is what greed does." He stared at her, the rage faltering, leaving only a vast, empty despair. He sagged, falling to his knees in the dusty street, and wept before the ruins of his life. 2 days later, the smoke had cleared, but the smell of ash hung over the river. The town shunned them. They were pariahs, the family that had brought the wrath of the railroad, the anger of the cavalry, down on them all. The meeting was held in the only place they could be assured of privacy, the old, abandoned adobe chapel on the edge of town, its roof long gone, its walls open to the sky. They came one by one, under the cover of a new moon. Elena, a silent, grim-faced Toyazi, who had slipped into town like a ghost. Old Man Peterson, whose springs were now patrolled by Silas's men. The 2 McCafferty brothers, their prize bull having been found shot. And Haston, Toe's uncle, his presence giving the meeting a weight and solemnity. They stood in the moonlight, a strange, desperate alliance. "He will not stop," Peterson said, his voice shaking. "He will take it all. What can we do? We are just farmers. We cannot fight the army. We cannot fight the railroad." "We cannot fight them with guns," Elena said, her voice echoing in the ruins. Everyone turned to her. "They have more guns, they have more men, and they have the law on their side, because they write the law." She looked at Toe, and then at his uncle. "You were right," she said to him. "They fight with paper, so we must, too." "What do you mean?" one of the McCafferty brothers asked. "I mean," she said, "we are going to Santa Fe. We go to the territorial court. We tell them everything. The shooting at the river, the frame-up of Private Harris, the ambush in the canyon, the forced sales, the fire." She looked at the circle of faces. "We got an injunction. We get a federal judge to stop him." It was a desperate, insane idea. A white woman, 2 ranchers, and 2 Navajo, riding to the Capitol to accuse the U.S., cavalry, and the richest man in the territory. "They will not listen," Haston said, his first words of the night. Toe translated, "They will not listen to us." He jested at his own chest. "They will listen to me," Elena said, "and they will listen to them." She pointed to Peterson and the McCaffertys. "And when they see you all together, telling the same story, they might just believe it." "It is a risk," Toe said, his eyes on Elena. "A great risk." "That is all we have left," she said. Meanwhile, in the fort's infirmary, James Caldwell was signing his name to a piece of paper. His left hand was heavily bandaged, 2 fingers lost to the splinters and the infection that had followed. He would never hold a rifle properly again. His career as a field officer was over. Silas McGraw stood beside him, holding the inkwell. "It is a shame," Silas said, "what that savage did to you. But opportunity, Lieutenant, opportunity." The paper was a contract. It named James Caldwell the new chief of security for the Northern Arizona Rail Line. With a salary that was 4 times his army pay, it gave him power. It gave him a budget. It gave him a private army, drawn from the civilian volunteers to protect the railroad's interests. James finished his signature, his new, clumsy scrawl. He was no longer a soldier. He was a corporate enforcer. He had lost his hand, his fiancée, and his honor, but he had gained a new and terrible power, and he had a single, burning focus. He would find Toyazi, and he would find Elena Harper, and he would erase them, and the humiliation they represented, from the face of the earth. Back in the ruins, Toe watched as the ranchers nodded, their faces hard with resolve. He looked at Elena, standing in the moonlight, her small frame defiant against the broken walls. She was right. The fight was no longer in the canyons. He moved to her side, standing close, a silent, public declaration. He looked at the smoldering remains of her home, the ashes pale in the dark. "They brought the war to your home, daughter of Harper," he said, his voice low, for her ears only. "Now we will bring the truth to theirs." The ashes of the trading post were a cold, gray grave. The alliance that had formed in the moonlight was a fragile, desperate thing. They set a day to leave for Santa Fe 5 days hence. It would take that long for the McCafferty brothers to secure their ranch, for old Peterson to make arrangements for his livestock, and for Elena to write down every memory, every date, every stolen detail, onto clean white paper. But there was an immediate, more pressing danger. On the night of the meeting in the ruins, Toyazi did not return to the high country. He stayed, hidden in the thick brush by the river, and watched. He saw a new patrol, led not by a uniformed cavalry officer, but by one of Silas McGraw's hard-faced men. They were not patrolling the town. They were watching the Navajo side of the river. James and Silas, having failed to kill him in the canyon, were now ensuring he could not escape. They were hunting, and they were patient. "I cannot go with you," he said to Hastine, his uncle, in the pre-dawn darkness. "Not yet." The old man nodded, his face grim. "They hunt you, the one who has your name." "They hunt all of us," Toe replied, "but they want me. If I am with the group, I will lead them straight to the women and children. I must take the families of the ones who escaped on a different path, a harder one, north, through the Badlands, a place the soldiers' horses cannot easily go. I will lead them to the Broken Hand Mesa. They will be safe there." "And the woman?" Hastine asked, his sharp old eyes on his nephew. "Elena." Toe spoke her name, and it felt different in his mouth. It was not the name of an enemy. "She goes to Santa Fe. With you. You will speak for our people. Uncle, you will tell the white judge what you have seen." "And you?" Toe looked east, toward the first faint hint of gray light. "I will take our people to safety, and then I will come back." He found Elena later that morning. She was sorting through the rubble of her home, her face smudged with soot, her hands raw. She was looking for anything to salvage. She had found a small, unbroken china doll, and she was weeping. He did not show himself. He waited. He waited until she had finished her grieving, until she had tucked the doll into her apron pocket and her face had set again into that hard, new mask of resolve. He made a low sound, the call of a mourning dove. She looked up, startled, and came to the edge of the riverbank, her heart pounding. He was across, half hidden in the reeds, his horse standing in the shadow of a cottonwood. "I cannot go," he called, his voice low but carrying over the water. "Not yet." Her face fell, a shadow of fear passing over her. "What do you mean?" "My people, the ones who escaped the canyon, the elders, the children. James and McGraw have men watching the easy trails. It is a trap set for me. I must lead them away, a long way, to the north." "But Santa Fe," she stammered. "The plan. We need you. I need you." "My uncle, Hastine, will go," he said. "He speaks your language. He carries the words of our people. You will go with him, you and the ranchers." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It was our plan. Together." "It is the only way," he said, and his voice was hard. "I will lead them to safety, and I will come back. I will meet you here." "When?" she cried, her voice desperate. He looked up at the sky, calculating the days, the miles, the risk. "You are to leave in 5 days. I will meet you here, on the 4th day, before the last light." He paused. "Before the sun sets on the 4th day. If I am not here, you must go without me." No, do not ask me to do that." "I am not asking," he said. "I am telling you, you must go. The papers you carry map your word. That is the weapon now. Not me, not my rifle. You must Go! You promised! He looked at her, one long, intense look.
4 days. Elena, I will be here.
He turned, and before she could say another word, he and his horse had vanished into the brush. The first day was a day of frantic work. Elena, her father, Haston, the McCafferty brothers, and old man Peterson met in the back room of the saloon, the only place they could gather, as the owner, fearing a boycott from the ranchers, had grudgingly allowed it. They wrote their testimonies. Elena, with her clear hand, transcribed the ranchers' angry, halting words. Haston spoke, and Elena translated, his story of broken treaties and stolen land, a stark, poetic counterpoint to the ranchers' claims of burned hay and shot cattle. They had the map. They had their truth. That evening, Elena went to the rock. The sun set, turning the river to blood, and the far bank remained empty. She told herself it was fine. He had said 4 days. The second day, the town's scorn became a tangible thing. As she walked to the saloon, Mrs. Davies, the woman from the church, spat on the ground at her feet.
Shame,
she hissed.
Lying with savages. You will get us all killed.
Elena kept walking, her head high. That evening, she went to the rock. The sun set, a fiery orange, and the wind was cold. He was not there. The third day, a fur trapper, a man named Riggs, came into the saloon, his pack reeking of cured hides and beaver musk. He was loud, full of news from the north, and he bought whiskey with a handful of coins. "It is a mess up in the Badlands," he announced to the room. "Saw it myself. Smoke, way up by the Broken Hand Mesa, and gunfire. It sounded like a damn war. Cavalry, by the looks of it, chasing a small band of Navajo. Found a few fresh graves. They did not stand a chance. The army does not take prisoners up there." Elena, who had been sitting in the corner, felt the blood drain from her face. She stood up, her chair scraping on the floor.
"What did you see?"
she asked, her voice tight. The trapper looked her up and down, a leering grin on his face. "Well, hello, Miss Harper. Did not see you there. Why, I saw a route, a small group, mostly women and old folks, are running down. They said the soldiers at the fort said they were hunting that warrior, the one they call Stormwalker. Looks like they finally got him." Elena's hand flew to her mouth. She backed away, turned, and ran from the saloon. She locked herself in her room. He was dead. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. He had led them north, and James or McGraw's men had found them. They had been waiting. It was another trap, and he had walked into it, trying to save his people. He had died, and she was alone. She did not weep. The grief was too cold, too deep. It was a block of ice in her chest. She sat on her cot, staring at the wall, for hours. Then, slowly, a new feeling rose up, burning through the ice. Rage, a cold, pure, and perfect rage. They would not win. James and Silas had taken her home. They had taken her father's spirit, and now they had taken tow. But they would not take the truth. She stood up. She washed her face in the basin. She looked at the stack of papers on her small desk. The testimonies, the map. She unpinned her hair and repinned it, pulling it back tightly from her face. She would go to Santa Fe. She would go alone, if she had to. She would stand in that courtroom, and she would burn them to the ground with the only weapon she had left. The fourth day, the day he had promised. She spent the morning making the final preparations. She packed a wagon with food, water, and a box of papers. Her father watched her, a ghost in his own home. He had not spoken a word against her since the fire, but he had not spoken a word for her, either. He was a broken man.
"We leave at dawn. Papa?"
she said, her voice gentle.
"Will you come?"
He looked at the ashes of his warehouse. "And go where?" "Elena, there is nothing for me in Santa Fe. There is nothing for me here. I will stay. I will guard the dust." She kissed his cheek. "I will come back," she said. That evening, she went to the river. She did not go with hope. She left with a kind of ritualistic sadness. It was the last time. She had to say goodbye. The sun was a huge, bleeding orb, balanced on the western mesas. It dyed the water a brilliant, heartbreaking shade of orange and gold. The air was cold, sharp with the coming of autumn. She pulled the old wool shawl, her mother's, tighter around her shoulders. She stood on the bank, not on her rock, and she watched the sun slip away. She watched the color fade. She felt the emptiness of the world, the vastness of the loss. He had been a storm, a shadow, a fire, and then, for one brief moment in a cave, he had been warm, and now he is gone. She closed her eyes, said his name in her mind, and then, her heart heavy and resolute, she turned to go. A sound made her stop. It was the sound of a horse, exhausted, moving through water. Not the sound of a patrol, trotting on the bank, but the sound of a heavy, weary animal lifting its feet from the mud, step by step. She turned. Her heart stopped. On the far bank, a silhouette, a horse and a rider. They were dark against the last fiery sliver of the sky. The rider was slumped, sitting low in the saddle. The horse plodded into the water. Its head down, it was walking, not swimming, finding the shallow ford. Elena did not breathe. It could not be. It was a ghost. It was her grief, playing a trick. The horse came closer, its breath pluming. The rider straightened. Just a little. He was wearing a dark, torn poncho. His left shoulder was wrapped in a crude, bloody bandage. His face was pale, streaked with dirt, but it was his Toyazi. He did not stop at the bank. He rode the horse right out of the water, onto the mud, until it stood, dripping and trembling, not 5 feet from her. He just looked at her. He looked at her as if he, too, were seeing a ghost. His eyes, dark with exhaustion and pain, moved over her face, memorizing her, as if to confirm she was real. She took one step, and then another. Her legs were shaking. You are," she whispered. The trapper's words, the smoke, the graves. "He said they said you were dead." "Not yet," he said, and his voice was a low, rough rasp. He slid from the horse. He did not drop. He landed on his feet, but he staggered. She ran to him, catching him as his knees buckled. You are hurt," she cried, her hands flying to the bandage, which was soaked. He pushed her hands away. Not roughly. He gripped her arms. He just held her, staring at her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The smell of his horse, of sweat, of old blood, filled her senses. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. "I am here," he said, as if it were the only fact that mattered in the universe. She started to cry then, not loud, sobbing tears, but silent, hot tears that ran down her face, washing away the dust. She had not let herself cry for him. She had not let herself believe. He pulled her closer, his good arm wrapping around her, crushing her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, and for a long, shuddering moment, he just held her, his entire body shaking with the tension of his journey, with the release of seeing her, safe, on the riverbank. She held him, her arms around his waist, her face pressed against his chest. She could feel the wild, exhausted hammering of his heart. He lifted his head, his hand coming up to cup her face. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the twilight. A slow, pained smile touched his lips. "You wait for the sunset every day, daughter of Harper," he whispered, his voice a rough tease. She nodded, unable to speak, her tears still flowing. "From now on," he said, his thumb brushing away a tear, "I am your sunset." She laughed, a wet, choked sound. "You are late," she whispered, and she hit his chest, a soft, frustrated blow. "He said you were dead. I thought—" "Shh," he said, and he kissed her. It was not the polite, dry kiss of James Caldwell. It was not a kiss of ownership. It was a kiss of arrival. It was desperate and hungry and full of the taste of dust, sweat, and the river. It was a kiss that said, "I am alive and you are real." It was tender, and it was deep, and it was everything she had never known she was waiting for. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. "The patrol," she said, her mind suddenly racing. "The trapper, the gunfire." "They were there," he said, his voice grim. He let her lead him to the rock, and he sank onto it, his bad arm held stiffly. "They were waiting for us. James, I saw him, but he was not alone. He had a new man, a tracker, a Mexicano. He knew the land. He knew the hidden trails."
"They ambushed you,"
she said, her heart cold. "They tried." Toe looked up at her. "But with this tracker, he led them into a box canyon. A different one. One I knew. He rode at them, firing, and yelled to me, 'Go, brother, they pay for my eyes, but not for my heart.' He gave us time. I got the children up the rocks. I was the last. One of his bullets found me." He touched his shoulder. "But the families are safe, at Broken Hand. The tracker I do not know." He had brought an ally, an unexpected one. The world was not as simple as she had thought.
"Toe,"
she said, touching his face.
"you are a fool, a brave, beautiful fool."
"I am a man who keeps his word," he said. He reached inside his torn shirt, his face twisting with pain. He pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped package. It was flat and heavy.
"What is it?"
she asked. "My ally," Toe said, a faint smile on his face. "The tracker. He gave me one more gift. He had been in their camp. He had seen the man, Silas McGraw." He unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was a small, black ledger, the kind a clerk would keep. "When I fell back," Toe said, "I did not go to the rendezvous. I went to their camp, the one they had set up for the ambush. They had all ridden out, all but one man, a clerk, left to guard the supplies. He was not a fighter." Elena opened the book. It was full of neat, spidery script, columns of names, dates, and amounts. Protection fee, Peterson Ranch, $50. Security, McCafferty Range, $75. Incentive, Harris P., $20. It was Silas McGraw's account book. It was his payroll for his army of thugs. It was a perfect, detailed account of his crimes. "This," Elena whispered, her hands shaking.
"Toe, this is this whole war, on paper."
"He fights with paper," Toe said, his voice faint. He was leaning heavily, his face pale. "Now so do we." The next morning, at dawn, the wagon was ready. It was not the wagon Elena had planned. This one had a false bottom. Old Man Peterson, his face set, had brought it. The alliance gathered. Elena, her face pale but resolute, her father's rifle at her side. Toyazi, his arm in a clean sling she had made, his face tight with pain but his eyes clear, sat on the wagon seat. Hastin, his uncle, wrapped in a traditional blanket, his silver hair braided. The two McCafferty brothers, on horseback, their rifles in their saddle scabbards, and a new, unexpected addition. A woman, her face burned by the sun and grief, had ridden in from the east. It was Mrs. Peterson, the wife of the old man's son, whose small ranch had been the first to burn, months ago. "I will speak," she had said, her voice raw. "I will tell them what they did to my home." They had the handwritten testimonies. They had the map. And now, hidden in the false bottom of the wagon, they had Silas McGraw's ledger. "They will be there before us," Elena said, looking at Toe. "They know we are coming. James and Silas. They will take the fast route, the stagecoach. They will have their lawyers. They will have their letters from senators." "Yes," Toe said. He looked at the slow, heavy wagon. He looked at the ranchers, at the grieving woman, at his uncle. They will have their speed, and their lies. He looked at her, and his good hand found hers. We will have the truth, and we will be slow, but we will be sure. The wagon lurched forward, heading east, toward Santa Fe, toward a new kind of war. Santa Fe was a different world. It was not a town of dust and raw lumber. It was a city of stone, adobe, and history. The streets were crowded, a noisy, vibrant collision of Mexican-American merchants, sharply dressed white politicians, territorial soldiers, and native peoples from a dozen different tribes, their blankets a riot of color against the tan walls. The palace of the governors was a long, low, impressive building, and the courthouse beside it was made of solid, cut stone. It looked permanent. It looked, Elena thought, like the law. She felt a surge of hope, her hand tightening on the handle of the box that held their papers. This was the system her father believed in, the one she had been taught to respect. Here, in this building, their words would surely be weighed fairly. Toyazi, walking beside her, did not share her optimism. His face, already grim with the pain of his healing shoulder, grew even tighter. He looked at the imposing building with a deep, weary cynicism. His arm was in a clean sling, but he wore his discomfort like a second skin, out of place and on edge. He had seen the white man's law before. He had seen it deliver justice to the rich and promises to the poor. To him, the building was just a bigger, more imposing version of the fort at Red Mesa. It was the place where the paper and the guns became one. Silas McGraw and James Caldwell were already there. They had arrived 2 days earlier on the fast stage, and they had not been idle. When Elena's small, worn-out party entered the courtroom, they saw their adversaries already seated at a polished table. Silas looked rested, his suit immaculate. James, his left arm now ending in a black-gloved, prosthetic hand, looked pale and venomous. Beside them sat a portly, well-dressed lawyer from Santa Fe, his satchel overflowing with documents. The territorial judge, a man named Elias Thorne, was older, with a full white beard and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed. He called the hearing to order, his voice a gravelly monotone. The first day belonged to Silas McGraw. His lawyer, Mr. Blevins, was a master of the craft. He did not speak of violence. He spoke of the future. He spoke of manifest destiny, economic prosperity, and taming the wilderness. He painted a picture of Red Mesa as a town on the brink of a golden age, an age that would be delivered by the iron rails of the northern Arizona line. Progress, Your Honor, has always had its detractors, Blevins said, his voice a smooth baritone. There are always those who wish to cling to the past, who fear the coming of the new. He presented his evidence. He had letters of encouragement from federal officials in Washington. He had the official, polished map of the proposed route, and he had a stack of sales contracts. Voluntarily signed, he said, by numerous ranchers along the route. Old man Peterson and the McCafferty brothers, sitting on the hard bench behind Elena, growled in their throats. The railroad, Blevins concluded, is not just a private enterprise, it is a patriotic duty, and all Mr. McGraw asks is for the court to remove the, shall we say, unruly obstacles to its completion. Then it was Elena's turn. She was not a lawyer. She had no smooth words. She had only her voice, and the truth. She stood before the judge, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She told her story. She started at the river, her voice faltering as she described the shooting of the child. She spoke of the ambush in the canyon, of James's men firing on a retreating group of families. She told of the fire, the Black Ledger, and the campaign of terror that had forced the ranchers to volunteer to sell their land. She was followed by old man Peterson, his voice shaking with anger as he described his hay barn burning. The McCafferty brothers jointly told of their cattle being shot, and Mrs. Peterson, her face a mask of grief, spoke in a low, dead voice of the night her home was burned, her husband driven from the land. The courtroom was quiet. Blevins, McGraw's lawyer, had let them all speak, and now he rose, like a spider. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "A terrible story. Truly, a story of fire, fear, and perhaps confusion." He paced before her. "Tell me, Miss Harper, is it true that, immediately following your break with Lieutenant Caldwell, you began to hold secret, nightly meetings with a known hostile, the very Navajo warrior who, by your own fiancé's report, ambushed his patrol?" The air was sucked from the room. Elena's face flushed. "We spoke, yes." "You spoke," Blevins repeated, savoring the words. "And is it not true that you were absent from your father's home for 2 full nights, in the company of this same savage a man you now champion, and he you?" There was an audible gasp from the gallery. Elena felt the stares, the judgment. She was, in one stroke, no longer a victim, but an adulteress, a traitor to her race and her station. This was the conflict versus society she had been warned of. "That is not it was a flash flood," she began. "Of course," Blevins said, waving his hand dismissively. "A convenient flood. Your Honor, I submit that this entire testimony is not the word of a reliable witness. It is the confused, hysterical fantasy of a jilted woman, a woman who, in her grief, has fallen under the sway of a savage and turned against her own people, against civilization itself." Before Elena could respond, a new voice spoke. It was deep, and it was calm. "She does not lie." Toyazi had risen. He walked to the front, his sling-bound arm a mark of defiance. He wore the clean, simple clothes Elena had found for him, but he was every inch the warrior. "Your Honor," Blevins sputtered. "This is an unsworn, unrepresented savage. He has no place." "He is a witness," Judge Thorne said, his gravelly voice cutting through the noise. He looked at Toe. "Do you speak English?" "I speak it," Toe said. "Then speak." Toe stood before the judge, but he did not speak to him. He spoke to the room, to the air, to the history that was listening. He hated this place. He hated the way they looked at him, as if he were an animal brought in for show. But he spoke. He did not speak of the law. He spoke of the earth. He described the land, not as miles and acres, but as grazing grounds, as sources of water, as sacred places. He described, in his precise, unadorned English, how the fences had come, how the soldiers had pushed his people into smaller and smaller corners, how the buffalo were gone, and now the iron snake had come to kill the very grass his sheep and horses needed to live. "Your law," he said, his dark eyes finding the judge's, "is a piece of paper that blows in the wind. But our law is the land. It is the water. And you are killing it. And you are killing us. For what? For a line on a map." The courtroom was utterly silent. The judge held his gaze for a long, long time. In that moment, it was not a savage and a judge. It was 2 old, tired men looking at each other across a gulf of history. "I see," Judge Thorne said, at last. "Thank you. You may step down." Elena, her heart hammering, her face burning from the lawyer's attack, rose again. "Your Honor, Mr. Blevins speaks of my confusion. I am not confused, and I have proof." She walked to the table and, from the wooden box, she took the black ledger. "This," she said, holding it up, "is Silas McGraw's account book, kept by his clerk." Silas McGraw, who had been relaxed, suddenly sat bolt upright. "This is an outrage," Blevins shouted, jumping to his feet. "Stolen property, a fabrication. This is inadmissible." "Is it?" Elena said, her voice clear and strong. "It lists payments, protection fees paid to men on the night Mr. Peterson's ranch was attacked, emergency paid to men on the night my father's warehouse was burned. It lists names, Your Honor, and it lists dates." Toe stepped forward again. "The judge," he said to Elena. Tell him to read the name, the one who was incentivized, and then read the date he was incentivized, and then ask the soldiers what day Private Harris was found dead." Elena's blood ran cold. She found the entry, "Incentive, Harris P., $20. The date was the day before he was murdered. The courtroom exploded. Judge Thorne hammered his gavel. "Order, order. I will have order. I will take this book into chambers. We will adjourn for the day. This court will reconvene at 9 tomorrow morning." The night was not restful. Elena's group had taken rooms at a small, clean boarding house near the plaza, run by a sympathetic Mexican-American widow. They were exhausted, but the day had given them a sliver of hope. The attack came just after midnight. Silas McGraw was not a man to wait for a judge's decision. He had 4 men in his employ, men who had not come on the stagecoach. They were not lawyers. They were the men who burned haystacks and shot cattle. They came in through the back. No guns. This was to be silent. Knives. Elena was in her room, the box with the duplicate testimonies at the foot of her bed. She had not been able to sleep. She was staring at the ceiling when she heard it. Not a sound, a lack of sound. The soft, creaking step on the floorboards that tried to be silent. A hand clamped over her mouth. A man, masked, smelling of whiskey, hissed in her ear, "The book, where is it?" She bit him hard. He yelled, and the house erupted. A man burst into Toe's room. Toe, who had been sleeping, sitting up in a chair, his shoulder a white-hot agony, was on his feet. The man had a knife. Toe, with only one good arm, was at a disadvantage. He kicked the man in the stomach, sending him reeling, but a second man was already in the hall. One of the McCafferty brothers, a giant of a man, burst from his own room, wielding a chair. He brought it down on the first man, who crumpled. But the second man, the one who had been in Elena's room, was now on Toe. He had Toe pinned against the wall, the knife at his throat. Toe was trying to keep the blade at bay with his one good hand, his muscles straining, the stitches in his shoulder tearing. Elena, her heart in her throat, had grabbed the one thing she had, the pistol. She had it in her hand as she ran into the hall. She saw Toe, his face pale, his eyes wide, the knife blade glinting. She saw the masked man, his body braced, about to drive the blade home. It was the canyon all over again, but this was not a rock. This was a man. She did not think. She raised the gun, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it, and she fired. The explosion in the narrow hallway was deafening. The man on top of Toe became rigid. He looked down at his chest, where a dark spot was spreading, with a look of pure surprise. Then he fell, sideways. Elena stood there, the gun smoking in her hand, her ears ringing. She was shaking from head to toe. She had just shot a man. She was going to be sick. The other 2 men, seeing their leader fall, did not wait. They scrambled out the back door, vanishing into the night. Toe slid down the wall, gasping, his good hand clutching his shoulder, which was bleeding again. McCafferty was standing over the unconscious man with the broken chair. Elena just stood there, staring at the man she had shot. He was not moving. Toe pushed himself to his feet and came to her. He did not look at the man. He looked at her. He saw the horror in her eyes. "Elena," he said, his voice rough. He took the gun from her trembling hand. "You did what you had to do. You saved my life. Again." "I killed him," she whispered. He looked down at the man, then knelt, checking his neck. "No," he said. "His heart is strong. You shot him in the shoulder, just like me." He almost smiled. "You have a bad habit of doing that." The arrival of the town marshal was a noisy, confused affair, but Mrs. Peterson, the grieving widow, took charge. She spoke in rapid, fluent Spanish, explaining that they were witnesses in a territorial hearing, that bandidos had attacked them. The marshal, seeing the quality of Toe's buckskin, and the ranchers, and the look in Elena's eyes, was not inclined to argue. He dragged the two men, one unconscious, one bleeding, to the jail and left a guard at the door. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. News of the attack had spread. When Judge Thorne entered, his face was like granite. "Before we begin," he said, "I am informed we have an unexpected witness, one who has come forward of his own accord." The side door opened. A small, thin man, his suit worn, his eyes darting around nervously, walked to the stand. He looked like a mouse in a room full of cats. "State your name," the bailiff ordered. Arthur Pendleton," he whispered. "I was Mr. McGraw's accountant." Silas McGraw's face turned white. Arthur Pendleton, it turned out, was a man with a conscience, albeit a small and terrified one. He had kept the books. He had seen the payments. He had been let go after the Red Mesa operation began, and he had been nursing his grievance and his fear ever since. But he had family in the East, and he had heard of a fire at a small ranch. He had a cousin who had died in a fire. "It was not right," he stammered, his hands twisting. "The ledger is real. That is my handwriting." "And these entries," the judge asked, holding up the book, "protection fee." "That is what Mr. McGraw called it when the men went to convince a landowner to sell. And emergency chi." "That," Pendleton whispered, "was for arson, or worse." "And this payment?" the judge asked, his voice terrible. "Incentive, Harris P." "Private Harris," Pendleton said, his eyes on the floor. "He was in debt to Mr. McGraw. Mr. McGraw said he would forgive the debt and pay him if he disappeared. He was supposed to meet a man named James Caldwell, who would give him a horse and money and tell him to ride to California." He looked up, his eyes full of fear. "He was not supposed to be killed. He was just supposed to disappear, so the army would have a reason to clean out the valley." The courtroom was so silent, it was as if the world had stopped. "James Caldwell," the judge said, his voice quiet. "Will you take the stand?" James walked to the stand. His face was a mask, his one good hand gloved, his prosthetic one resting on the rail. Blevins, the lawyer, looked pale. He had not been prepared for this. He tried to perform, as Silas had hoped. He denied everything. He was a soldier. He was a hero. This was all a conspiracy, a lie told by a jilted woman and a mouse of a clerk. But the ledger was there. The dates were there. The money was there. "You signed the payment vouchers for these security men," the judge said, holding up a new piece of paper, one subpoenaed from the fort. "Your signature, Lieutenant, for civilian volunteers. On the same day the McCafferty Ranch was attacked, on the same day the Peterson barn was burned, on the same day Private Harris was paid to disappear." James looked at the papers. He looked at the judge. He looked at Silas McGraw, who was staring at him with cold, dead eyes, already cutting his losses. And then he looked at Elena. She was not looking at him with hate or anger. She was looking at him with a kind of cold, clinical pity. She was looking at him as if he were a bug, a piece of rot, a thing to be examined and discarded. That look was the thing that broke him. The mask of the hero, the civilized officer, shattered. All the rage, all the humiliation, all the failure of the last month had exploded. "So what?" he roared, leaping to his feet, his one good hand smashing down on the rail. "So what if I did? Do you know what it is like out there? Do you know the filth we are trying to build a country, a real country, and they—" He pointed a shaking globed finger at Toyazi. "They are in the way. They are animals. They are not even people." A collective, horrified gasp filled the room. Judge Thorne did not move. He did not blink. He waited until the echo of James's shout had faded. He banged his gavel. "Once. This hearing," he said, his voice like the crack of ice, "is concluded." He was back in 10 minutes. "It is the order of this court," he announced. that a temporary, binding injunction is placed on any and all land transactions, sales, or surveys related to the Northern Arizona rail line within the Red Mesa Territory, pending a full federal investigation. It is further ordered, he continued, that all voluntary sales contracts signed within the last 6 months, under the climate of violence and intimidation established here today, be considered null and void, pending review. It is further ordered, he boomed, that a criminal investigation be opened by the federal marshals into Silas McGraw, James Caldwell, and their associates on charges of conspiracy, bribery, arson, and likely murder. He looked at James, who had collapsed back into his chair, a broken, hollow man. And finally, the judge said, his eyes moving to Toe and Hastine, this court formally recognizes the long-standing, traditional, and historic right of residency of the Navajo people along the Red Mesa River Basin, at least until the federal government, in its wisdom, decides to act. This court will not see them moved by force. This case is closed. It was not a total victory. The war was not over, but they had won the battle. Silas McGraw had lost his law. Elena, Toe, Heston, and the ranchers walked out of the courthouse, blinking into the bright Santa Fe sun. They were exhausted. They were bruised. They were victorious. Elena sat down, hard, on the bottom step of the courthouse. Her hands, she noticed, were still shaking. Not from fear, from the memory of the gun. Toyazi, his bad arm in a new, clean sling, his face pale with pain, sat down beside her. He did not say, "Thank you." He did not say, "We won." He just sat, close, in the warm sun. He reached over with his good hand, and he took her shaking one. He held it, his skin warm and strong against hers. They sat there, in the silence, and for the first time, they felt the truth, written not in blood, but in ink, and for now, it was enough. The ride back to Red Mesa was slow, heavy, and quiet. They were not the same people who had left. They returned not to a town of whispers, but to a town of stunned, angry silence. The news, carried by the telegraph from Santa Fe, had arrived before them. The grand promise of the Northern Arizona rail line was dead. Silas McGraw did not return with them. He had been detained in Santa Fe, but the news of his arrest and the injunction was enough. The bank in Prescott, which had extended him a massive line of credit, immediately froze his assets. His partners, men who had been eager to share in the profits, wanted nothing to do with the scandal. The civilian volunteers he had hired, now just a gang of thugs without a paymaster, vanished into the territory, taking their wages in stolen horses. Silas's empire, built on paper and fear, had collapsed in on itself. James Caldwell returned, but not as an officer. He was suspended from duty, his uniform and sidearm confiscated pending a full court-martial. He arrived on the back of a supply wagon, a passenger, his one good hand and his black-gloved prosthetic resting uselessly in his lap. He stayed at the fort for 1 day, packing his belongings. Elena saw him only once. She was standing by the river, her river, when he came to the ferry landing. He was in civilian clothes, a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He looked small and gray and hollowed out. He stood on the landing, a single carpetbag at his feet, and he looked across the water. Not at her, but at the empty mess beyond. He looked for a long time. When the ferry arrived, he boarded it without a backward glance. A lone, pathetic figure, exiled by his own ambition, disappearing into the dust from whence he came. Red Mesa was a town waking from a fever. The dream of a quick, railroad-fueled fortune was gone, and the town was forced to look at what was left each other. The tension, the palpable fear of the Navajo threat, had evaporated overnight. It had been, they all now understood, a lie, a story told by a rich man to get what he wanted. And the ranchers, men like Peterson and the McCaffertys, were the first to change. They had sat in a courtroom and seen the truth. They had seen Elena Harper, their neighbor's daughter, stand against the money in the army. They had seen the Navajo, not as a faceless threat, but as men, like Hastin, with wisdom, and men, like Toyatsi, with a courage that had, in the end, saved them all. They realized, with a slow, dawning clarity, that the man who had burned their hay was not the man across the river. The man who had shot their cattle was the man who wore a blue uniform. The rebuilding of the trading post began 2 days later. It was not a Harper project. It was a town project. It started with Old Man Peterson. He arrived at dawn, his wagon loaded with fresh-cut pine beams. "Cannot have a town without a proper post," he grunted, not looking at Elena's father. "Samuel, this is for the injunction." Then the McCafferty brothers arrived, with their ranch hands and a string of mules. "We have a debt," was all they said, and they began clearing the rubble. The saloon owner, the blacksmith, even some of the women who had whispered about Elena. They came. They brought food, coffee, and the few supplies they had. They were rebuilding their town, not just the store. They were rebuilding the idea of a town, one based on mutual survival, not imported fear. Samuel Harper, who had been a ghost wandering the ashes of his life, stood and watched them for a full hour. He watched them raise the first wall. He watched Toyazi, his arm still in a sling, his good hand showing a rancher how to brace a crossbeam. Then Samuel Harper, his face streaked with soot and tears, picked up a hammer and began to work. He found Heston, who was directing the placement of the foundation stones. Samuel stopped, looked at the old man, and gave a stiff, awkward nod. "Ya'ati," Samuel said, fumbling the Navajo greeting he had heard Elena use. Hastings' wrinkled face broke into a slow smile. He nodded back. "Ya'ati," he replied. Samuel Harper, his pride and his purpose returning, pounded the first nail. He was, once again, the father of Elena Harper, and he had never been more proud. The new building was larger than the old one, and it was different. It was part store, part warehouse, and part meeting hall. Elena, with a donation of books from the judge in Santa Fe, started a small library. It became, as she had always hoped, a bridge. It was the only place in the territory where you could see a white rancher, a Mexican vaquero, and a Navajo elder sharing a cup of coffee by the stove, arguing over the price of wool or the lack of rain. The new community needed new rules. The old ones, the ones that had led to so much blood, were dead. The meeting was held not in a church or a saloon, but on the riverbank, the neutral ground. Toyazi and Heston sat on a log. Peterson and the McCaffertys sat opposite them. Elena stood between them, not as a translator, but as a scribe, a witness. "The water," Peterson said. "It is for all, but my cattle need the springs." "Our horses," Toe replied, his English quiet but firm, "must have a path to the river. The southern graze is ours." "That is fair," McCafferty said, surprising himself. "But the passage must be agreed. No surprises." They did not make a treaty. They did not sign a federal document. They made a pact. They drew a map in the dirt, marking grazing lines, water rights, and paths of safe passage. They agreed on it, man to man. Then Elena, on a single sheet of paper, wrote it all down in clean, simple English. They did not sign it. They stood, and they shook hands. Haston shook Peterson's hand. Toe shook McCafferty's. It was a new law, their law, born not from Washington, but from the shared red earth. Toyazi changed. The fire of the lone warrior, the man who walked with storms, had cooled. It had not gone out. It had banked, becoming the steady, enduring heat of a leader. He was no longer just a protector of his own people. He was a mediator for the entire valley. When a dispute arose, a stray cow, a fence line, A misunderstanding, it was Toe they sought. He would listen, his face unreadable, his knowledge of both worlds allowing him to see the truth that lay between the words. He had traded the vengeance of the warrior for the wisdom of the peacekeeper. Elena, too, was changed. The men she might marry no longer defined her. She was defined by the life she had built. The town looked to her. The ranchers trusted her. The Navajo called her she who speaks true. But the night of the attack in Santa Fe had left a scar. She still woke, some nights, her hands smelling of gunpowder, the sound of the shot echoing in her ears. She would see the man's face, the look of surprise as he fell. You found her, one such night, sitting by the cold hearth, her mother's shawl around her, her hands trembling. He did not speak. He sat beside her, his presence a solid, warm comfort in the darkness.
I shot him. Toe,
she whispered, her voice a raw sound in the quiet room.
I took a life.
He was silent for a long moment. Then he took her trembling hands in his one good one. No, he said, his voice gentle. You saved a life. You saved my life. The man made a choice when he came into that house with a knife. You made a choice, too. He looked into her eyes, his own gaze clear and steady. You chose to save more lives, Elena, than to let your fear keep you still. That is not murder. That is courage. He held her, and for the first time since that night, she let the terror go, weeping into his shoulder, not for the man she had shot, but for the woman she had been forced to become. Their future was not a thing of whispered promises. It was a practical, daytime discussion, held, as all their important talks were, by the river. They were working on the new post, their hands sore. The work here is good, Toe said, as he sat beside her by the new, unpainted wall. Your father is a strong man.
He is,
Elena said, smiling.
He has his pride back.
And you, he said, turning to her. What will you do? When will the post be finished? When will winter come?
I will be here,
she said, confused.
This is my home.
This is one of your homes, he said. He looked at her, his face serious. My home is in the high country, in the camp. We, my people, move with the seasons. We follow the herds.
I know,
she said, her heart beginning to beat faster. I am asking you. Elena, he said, his voice low. If you are willing to live between two worlds, I am asking if you will come with me, to my world, and I will come with you, to yours. We can help build both. It was the strangest, most beautiful proposal in the world. He was not asking her to be his wife, to be a Mrs. and disappear into his life. He was asking her to be his partner. He was asking her to stand with him, her feet in both worlds. Yes, she said, her voice soft. I am not afraid. I do not want to belong to any one place. I want to build with you. The sun was setting. They were not at the post, but at their rock, the old, familiar place. They sat, not in silence, but in a comfortable quiet, their shoulders touching, their feet dangling in the cool evening water. The river was running a deep, clear purple, reflecting the sky. He wrapped his arm, his good, strong arm, around her shoulders, pulling her close. He kissed her hair. Do you remember, daughter of Harper? He whispered, his voice full of a warm, teasing smile. I am still your sunset. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full, her world. For the first time finally, completely whole. And I, she whispered back, am your Riverbank, the place you always come home to. Years passed. A railroad was eventually built, but it followed a different path, a path of commerce, not conquest, far to the south, from the high country. On a clear night, you could sometimes hear its faint, lonely whistle, but it was just a sound, a harmless piece of the distant world. The Red Mesa trading post was a landmark. It was a place of fairness, a place of peace. And on the riverbank, on any given summer evening, You could see the children. They were a noisy, bright, scrambling pack. Some were pale, with sun-bleached hair. Some were dark, with the black, shining hair of the Navajo. And some were a beautiful, perfect blend of both. They would argue in a fluent, shouted mix of English and Navajo, their games of cowboys and soldiers far more complex than their parents could have ever imagined. And often, standing on the porch of the trading post, watching the sunset bleed into the water, were a man and a woman. He was a leader, his hair now streaked with silver, his wisdom known across the territory. She was the heart of the valley, her face lined with laughter and sun, her eyes as clear and true as the day she had first chosen her path. Elena and Toyasi, they stood, side by side, watching the river. They were not waiting for the future. They were not bound by the past. They were, and would always be, simply home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. It means the world to us. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you are in. We love to see how far these tales travel. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really loved it, please hit that hype button to help us share these stories with more listeners. We appreciate every single one of you.